In 1964, one man bent the rules of General Motors and handed America the muscle car. By 2010, the same corporation had ended everything he built. This is the complete story of Pontiac, the greatest performance brand Detroit ever produced and the one they decided they couldn't afford to keep. Chapter 1. The Rebel Who Built a Legend. In the early 1960s, General Motors had a rule, a hard rule, a corporate mandate that nobody inside any of its divisions was supposed to question. No mid-size Pontiac, Oldsmobile, or Buick would carry an engine displacing more than 330 cubic inches. On paper, the rule made sense. GM didn't want its own brands competing with each other. They didn't want a hot Pontiac Tempest stealing sales from a full-size Bonneville. The corporation wanted order, control, predictable structure. But there was a problem. One man inside Pontiac's engineering department didn't care about any of that. His name was John Zachary DeLorean. He was Pontiac's chief engineer. And by 1963, he was already restless. DeLorean had spent years watching competitors make moves. He'd watched Ford shake the entire industry with aggressive product decisions. He'd watched the Chevrolet Corvette build a devoted following that crossed class lines. He'd watched American buyers open their wallets for power and speed, and he knew Pontiac was sitting on something that could redefine the entire market. The car he had in mind was built on the Tempest Le Mans platform. A solid mid-size car, affordable, accessible. But DeLorean wanted to drop Pontiac's 389 cubic inch V8 directly into the engine bay. That put the displacement at 60 cubic inches over the corporate limit. It wasn't a gray area. It was a direct violation. So DeLorean and engineer Bill Collins did something that would change American car history forever. They didn't build a new car. They packaged the 389 as a dealer option, a $296 add-on to the Tempest Le Mans. On every piece of paperwork, the car was still a Tempest. The engine was technically just an option. GM's management approved it without fully grasping what they had just allowed. DeLorean called it the GTO. He borrowed the name directly from Ferrari, Gran Turismo Omologato, the designation that Ferrari used for their road racing Grand Tourers. Ferrari was not pleased, but DeLorean wasn't asking anyone for permission. The 1964 Pontiac GTO came standard with a 389 cubic inch V8, making 325 horsepower. If you check the tri-power option box, 3 two-barrel carburetors sitting on a special intake manifold, you left the dealership with 348. In a mid-size car, for the price of a base option package, GM's own internal projections said Pontiac might sell 5,000 of them. Maybe. They sold 32,450 units in the very first year. Car and Driver magazine ran a comparison test between the GTO and a Ferrari GTO. Pontiac's car lost but barely, and the story generated national attention that no advertising budget could have bought. Suddenly, every young American with a driver's license and a dream knew exactly what those 3 letters meant. The automotive press started reaching for a new term, something nobody had really said before about a production American car. They called it a muscle car. What's remarkable is how close it came to never happening. Several GM executives had actively worked to stop the GTO before it launched. At least one divisional review board nearly rejected it outright. DeLorean fought for it through every meeting, every boardroom session, every hallway conversation where someone told him it couldn't work. The man was not built for corporate compliance. He was built for results. And the results in 1964 made one thing perfectly clear. The American car buyer was hungry for power, hungry for speed, and completely willing to pay for both. Pontiac had just given them exactly what they wanted. The muscle car era had officially begun. And it started because one engineer at Pontiac decided the rules didn't apply to him. Chapter 2, when Pontiac owned the streets. By 1965, the GTO wasn't just popular. It was a cultural event, and Pontiac was nowhere close to finished. The second-year GTO came with a revised body, a new stacked headlight design, and and expanded options lists that let buyers configure their car in hundreds of different ways. The standard 389 made 335 horsepower. Tri-Power went up to 360. But the number that really defined this era came in 1966. That year, Pontiac sold 96,946 GTOs, nearly 100,000 units in a single model year. For a car that started as a rule-bending option package, the GTO was now its own model line, no longer hiding behind the Tempest nameplate. It stood on its own identity, and it was outselling every competitor in the segment that Pontiac itself had created. Every other American automaker was running to catch up. Ford had the Mustang, but the original Mustang was a pony car, smaller, lighter, initially designed around economy rather than brute power. Mopar was making aggressive moves with their 440 and the 426 Hemi. Chevrolet had the Chevelle SS, but the GTO was the original. Pontiac had invented this space. They'd named it, defined it, and for a few years, in the mid-60s, they were leading the field. Then, on February 23rd, 1967, Pontiac changed the game again. The Firebird arrived. Sharing the F-body platform with Chevrolet's new Camaro, the Firebird was Pontiac's answer to the pony car segment. But where the Camaro was positioned as a raw performance machine, the Firebird came with something the Camaro didn't, a sense of visual sophistication that was distinctly Pontiac. The 1967 Firebird was available in 5 distinct configurations. At the base, an overhead cam 6-cylinder for the practical buyer. At the top, the Firebird 400, a 4 to 100 cubic inch V8, making 325 horsepower standard, and 345, with a high output ram air option. Enthusiasts noticed immediately. Long hood, short deck, wide stance. That split Pontiac grille carried forward into a sportier, lower package. This wasn't just a Camaro with a different nose. This was a Firebird. But Pontiac still had the GTO in full force. And in 1968, they went further. The ram air system, now a defining feature of the GTO's hood design, fed cold outside air directly to the carburetor at speed, functional, not decorative. The kind of engineering detail that enthusiasts of that era recognized immediately. At wide open throttle, a ram air GTO could pull through the quarter mile in the mid 13-second range. That was genuine world-class performance for an American street car in 1968. And then came 1969, the year Pontiac gave America 2 cars that would never be forgotten. First, the Judge. Named after a catchphrase from the popular television show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, the Judge was Pontiac's answer to the budget muscle wars. Plymouth had just dropped the price on the Roadrunner to make serious performance accessible at a lower price point. Pontiac responded with an option package priced at $332 over the base GTO. What you got for that money? Ram Air 3, 366 horsepower, a high rear spoiler, graphics that made sure nobody on the street missed you, and colors that pushed every boundary of American automotive design. Carousel red, Verdoro green, goldenrod yellow. The Judge did not hide from anyone. And second, the Trans Am. Based on the Firebird, the Trans Am was initially offered in a single color combination, cameo white with bright blue racing stripes. It came standard with the Ram Air 3 4 to 100 cubic inch V8. For buyers willing to go all the way, Ram Air 4 was available officially 345 horsepower, though the engineers who ran them privately knew that number left some room. In its first model year, Pontiac built just 697 Trans Ams. It was almost a prototype, a statement of intent, more than a volume product. Nobody in the room at Pontiac or anywhere else in Detroit fully understood what that white car with the blue stripes was going to become. By the end of 1969, Pontiac sat at the center of American performance culture. The GTO had built an entire industry around itself. The Firebird and Trans Am were establishing their own passionate audience. Pontiac's engineering team was regarded as among the most innovative in Detroit, possibly the most innovative. For that brief window in time, the late 1960s, Pontiac was exactly what John DeLorean had always pushed it to be. The most exciting brand in America, and they were about to build the most beautiful car this country had ever seen. Chapter 3, the most beautiful car America ever built. In the automotive world, certain designs are merely good. Others are great. And then there are the ones that still stop people in their tracks 50 years later. The ones that still cause arguments about whether anything that came before or after ever truly matched them. The 1970 Pontiac Firebird is one of those cars. The second generation Firebird was originally planned for the 1969 model year. GM pushed the release back repeatedly. Safety regulation changes, cost pressures, development revisions. When the car finally arrived as a 1970 model, technically a mid-year release beginning in February, it was worth every single day of the delay. The design team, operating under GM styling chief William Mitchell, created something that had no direct comparison anywhere in Detroit at the time. The hood stretched forward in one long, unbroken line. The Endura impact-resistant nose eliminated the traditional chrome bumper in favor of a body-colored, integrated front end that looked like the car had been shaped by hand rather than assembled from parts. The fastback roofline swept cleanly down into the rear deck. No sharp edges, no excess. The entire car read as a single unified form rather than a collection of panels bolted together. Automotive journalists ran out of useful superlatives. One writer called it the finest body design ever placed on an American production car. Several European publications took notice, which in 1970 was not something that happened often with domestic vehicles. And then there was the Trans Am version. The 1970 Trans Am took that already stunning second-generation body and added functional aerodynamic elements that American performance cars had simply never seen at this price point. A front air dam that actually reduced lift at speed, a rear spoiler engineered rather than decorative, and the shaker hood scoop, a functional air inlet that protruded directly through the hood and moved with the engine as it torqued under load. The shaker was the most visceral visual connection between driver and machine that any American production car had ever offered. You could look out the windshield and watch your engine breathe. Ram Air 3 delivered 335 horsepower. Ram Air 4 pushed 345. And Pontiac's own engineers, the ones who built these cars and then tracked them privately, knew the real-world output exceeded what the official documentation said. 1971 brought one of the most significant single moments in Pontiac history. And not in the way anyone would have hoped. The auto industry, responding to increasing pressure from federal regulators and the insurance industry, began transitioning away from high compression engines. Lower compression ratios meant the cars could run on regular fuel without premium grade leaded gasoline. That was the regulatory requirement coming down the pipeline. But lower compression also meant lower power output. The physics were unavoidable. Pontiac's response in 1971 was one of the most impressive final statements an engineering team has ever made under constraint. They introduced the 4 to 155 cubic inch high output V8, the 455 HO, officially rated at 335 horsepower on the gross measurement scale that was still being used that year. Torque, 380 foot-pounds, more torque than a Ferrari Daytona, in a car that costs a fraction of the price. The 455 high output was born at exactly the wrong moment in history. It arrived just as the industry was beginning its organized retreat from big displacement, high compression performance. It was a final declaration from Pontiac's engineering team, proof that they could still build something extraordinary, even as the walls closed in around them. Historians who study this era regard the 1971 Trans Am with the 455 HO as one of the most capable American performance cars ever produced. Not just for its era, period, but even as those cars rolled off the line, forces were gathering that would alter everything about American performance. The clock was running, and Pontiac didn't know it yet, but the high water mark was already behind them. Chapter 4, 3 forces that changed America. By the start of 1972, 3 separate forces had been building pressure on the American muscle car for years. Any one of them alone might have slowed the horsepower era. Together, they ended it. The first was the federal government. The Clean Air Act of 1970 set emissions targets that Detroit was going to have to meet. Compression ratios, the primary driver of performance in a gasoline engine, would have to come down to work with the low lead and unleaded fuels the government was mandating for the years ahead. Detroit had built an entire performance culture around high compression engines running on premium leaded fuel. That was now changing at the regulatory level, and there was no arguing with it. In 1972, the entire auto industry switched from gross horsepower ratings to SAE net horsepower, a measurement taken with all engine accessories connected, reflecting real-world output more accurately. The physics of the engine hadn't changed. The method of measuring it had. But for a buyer standing in a showroom reading a window sticker, the numbers looked dramatically smaller overnight. An engine that had been advertised at 340 horsepower the year before might now display 260. The car was the same. The perception was entirely different. The second force was the insurance industry. Throughout the late 1960s, insurance companies had been watching claim data accumulate from high-performance vehicles, young male drivers, high-displacement V8s, accident rates trending upward. The industry's response was direct and financially calculated. Surcharges on performance vehicles became standard practice in the early 1970s. In some markets, the cost of insuring a 4 to 100 cubic inch V8 was greater than the monthly car payment itself. Buyers who could technically afford the car couldn't afford to put it on the road legally. The customer base for traditional muscle cars began contracting in real time. The third force arrived on October 16th, 1973, and it hit American automotive culture like nothing the industry had ever experienced. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against the United States. The embargo would run through March of 1974. What followed was a national crisis. Gasoline prices quadrupled. Odd-even rationing systems were introduced. Lines at stations stretched for hours. People sat in their cars waiting to buy fuel, while others ran out before they reached the pump. The one thing no American buyer wanted in the fall of 1973, the very thing that had made a car like the GTO thrilling, was a high-displacement, fuel-hungry V8. For Pontiac, the timing was brutal. The GTO had already been moved to a smaller platform for the 1973 model year. The Ventura, a Nova-based compact chassis, had replaced the traditional A-body that had made the original GTO so formidable. The car was smaller, lighter on its feet, but fundamentally diminished from the car that had launched the whole era a decade earlier. Sales had been in decline since the peak of 1966. Now, with the oil crisis creating a nationwide atmosphere of fuel anxiety, the 1973 GTO sold just 7,675 units. That was less than 8% of what the car had sold at its best. Pontiac tried once more in 1974. The GTO returned, carrying a base 250 horsepower V8, a car that bore no meaningful connection to the car that had started everything. Fewer than 7,000 units sold. Pontiac discontinued the GTO after the 1974 model year. The car that had invented an entire category of American automobile, the car that had put Pontiac on the map as the most exciting brand in Detroit, was gone. John DeLorean had left General Motors the year before. Frustrated by years of corporate constraint and by what was being done to the performance cars he'd built his career around, he walked away in 1973. The man who had handed America the muscle car was gone. And the forces that had been closing in on Pontiac for 3 years had, on the surface, won. Chapter 5, Pontiac's Last Stand. While the GTO was disappearing from dealer lots and corporate boardrooms were calculating the cost of every horsepower, Pontiac's engineering team was doing something remarkable. They built one last weapon, the 455 Super Duty, available in 1973 and 1974, in both the Firebird and the Trans Am. The SD455 was officially rated at 290 horsepower net, 290. In the same year that the GTO had a 250 horsepower base engine, every engineer who built them, every journalist who tested them, and every enthusiast who put one on a dynamometer in a controlled setting understood that the official number was not telling the complete story. The SD455 had been developed with racing in mind before emissions. Constraints came down. It used round port exhaust manifolds, a more efficient design than the standard D-port used in street engines. The rotating assembly was stronger than standard production specification required. The compression ratio had been reduced to meet regulations, but everything underneath that lower compression ratio was built to a standard that the street market rarely saw. Road tests showed quarter-mile times in the mid-13-second range. Car and Driver tested a Trans Am SD 455 in 1973 and clocked 13.5 seconds through the quarter mile in 1973 during an oil crisis. With compression ratios falling industry-wide, Pontiac had built one of the quickest production cars in America. Pontiac assembled just 252 SD 455 Trans Ams for the 1973 model year. In 1974, that number grew to 943 units before the engine was discontinued as regulations tightened further. Those cars exist today, and they are among the most collectible and valuable Pontiacs ever produced, precisely because they represent something specific. A group of engineers who refused to stop fighting for what the brand had always stood for. But the story nearly ended right here, and not just the SD 455, all of it. In the early 1970s, General Motors conducted a review of the F-body platform that the Firebird shared with the Camaro. The economics were not favorable. Sales had declined significantly. The platform was expensive to maintain and update. GM management ran the numbers and concluded that the financial return did not justify continued production. The vote to discontinue the Firebird reportedly came within a single executive decision of passing. It didn't pass. The Firebird survived. Not because the spreadsheets said it should, not because the return on investment was clean, but because enough people inside General Motors understood what the Firebird represented and believed it still had a future if given the chance. The mid-70s Firebirds were quiet cars by the standards of the era that had produced them. The most powerful engine available by 1975 was a 4 to 100 cubic inch V8, making 185 horsepower net. Compare that number to the 345 horsepower Ram Air 4 of just 5 years earlier, and the distance between those two cars feels like a decade of progress moving in reverse. But the Firebird was still being built, still being bought, still carrying a name that carried real meaning for the people who remembered what it had been. Pontiac had survived the worst the decade had thrown at them. The GTO was gone. The big block power was gone. The era that had defined them was over. But something was coming that nobody inside General Motors boardrooms had anticipated. A movie was headed to theaters. Chapter 6, The Bandit Saved Everything. In 1977, a film called Smokey and the Bandit opened in American theaters. It cost $4,300,000 to produce. It grossed over $300 million worldwide. And it did something that no advertising campaign, no auto show appearance, no magazine feature could have achieved. It turned the Pontiac Trans Am into the most desirable car in America overnight. Burt Reynolds played the Bandit. The 1977 Trans Am played itself. Black and gold, top roof, a 403 cubic inch V8, pushing the car across the screen with an authority that made audiences lean forward in their seats. The car wasn't just transportation in that film. It was the co-star. It had screen presence that most actors spend entire careers trying to develop. Every kid who watched Smokey and the Bandit in the summer of 1977 wanted that black Trans Am. Their older brothers wanted it, their fathers wanted it, and in many cases, they went looking for it. In 1976, Pontiac had sold just over 8,000 Trans Ams for the full model year. In 1978, 1 year after the film's release, at the peak of its cultural reach, Pontiac sold 68,745 Trans Ams. 68,000. From 8,000 in 2 years, a single Hollywood film had accomplished what Pontiac's own marketing team had been unable to manage across years of effort. The Trans Am had been repositioned in the American imagination, not as a performance car from a difficult era, but as an outlaw icon built for a new generation. The black and gold special edition package became the defining automotive aesthetic of the late 1970s. You didn't need to be a car person to recognize a Pontiac Trans Am in 1978. The Bandit had taken care of that. Pontiac understood the moment and responded accordingly. In 1979, they celebrated the Trans Am's 10th anniversary with a limited edition that remains one of the most distinctive special packages in American car history. The 10th anniversary Trans Am was finished in black and silver, a departure from the Bandit's gold, but equally commanding. silver accent striping, a silver interior, revised front fascia treatment. Pontiac built 7,500 of them. They were committed before they reached dealerships. 1980 brought another milestone, the Trans Am as the official pace car for the Indianapolis 500. Finished in white with gold accents, the pace car edition was powered by a turbocharged 4.9-liter V8 rated at 210 horsepower. By the absolute standards of the golden era, 210 horsepower would have seemed modest. But in 1980, in the depths of a second energy crisis, with emissions regulations at their most restrictive, 210 horsepower in a production American performance car was not something to dismiss. More importantly, it proved that Pontiac was still looking, still pushing, still trying to find performance within whatever constraints the world handed them. What the Bandit era proved was something that car enthusiasts had always known, but corporate accounting sometimes forgot. The American public's desire for performance doesn't simply disappear. It can be pressured by economics, it can be reduced by regulation, it can be quieted by circumstance, but the want is still there, underneath everything. Burt Reynolds and a black Pontiac Trans Am reminded an entire generation of that truth. The question now was whether Pontiac could carry this momentum into a new decade, or whether the brand repeat the cycle of peak and collapse that had defined the early 1970s. In 1982, they were about to find out. Chapter 7, the brand that never quit. The third generation Firebird arrived in 1982, and it did not look like any Pontiac that had existed before it, where the second generation had been defined by organic, sculpted curves, what many still consider the most beautiful production car design in American history. The third generation went in a completely different direction. Angular, aerodynamic, deliberately forward-looking. The hood was low and flat. The greenhouse raked steeply. The door handles were recessed nearly flush with the bodywork. In the wind tunnel, the third generation was significantly more aerodynamically efficient than its predecessor. GM had committed real engineering resources to aerodynamic development, and the results were measurable. Inside, the dashboard looked like something from a science fiction production. Pontiac offered digital instrument clusters with LED readouts that, in 1982, felt genuinely ahead of what domestic vehicles were offering. But under the hood, the story was more complicated. The emissions era was fully in effect. The base third-generation Firebird came with a 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine, a configuration that would have seemed almost inconceivable in a car carrying the Firebird name just a decade earlier. The V6 was the middle option. The 5-liter V8 was available, but in its initial 1982 specification, it produced 145 horsepower. For a car with this degree of visual presence, that was a challenging number to live with. Pontiac worked steadily to address the gap. Throughout the mid-1980s, engine output climbed progressively as fuel injection technology improved and engineers found ways to extract more from the available displacement within regulatory limits. The 5-liter high-output V8 went from 145 horsepower at launch to 160. Then 165, then 190, as refinements continued year after year. The gap between what the car looked like it could do and what it actually did was closing. In 1987, Pontiac pulled from their history and delivered something that finally matched the visual promise of the third-generation design, the GTA, Grand Touring America. The Trans Am GTA package was the most serious performance effort Pontiac had made since the Super Duty era. It came equipped with the 5.7-liter tuned port injection V8, the same engine found in the Corvette, producing 210 horsepower. With a suspension package, wider wheels and tires, and a complete aerodynamic treatment that made the car look as fast as it actually was. Road tests showed sub-6 second 0 to 60 times, quarter-mile runs in the high 13-second range. In 1987, in the context of what domestic performance cars could do, that was genuinely competitive territory. Pontiac was building a different kind of performance car now, not the straight-line, high-compression thunderbolts of the 1960s. Something more complete, a car that handled, braked, and performed across multiple dimensions in ways the original muscle cars simply couldn't. And then, for For the Trans Am's 20th anniversary in 1989, Pontiac produced something that raised eyebrows in every corner of the automotive press. They chose a turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 as the engine for their limited anniversary edition. A V6 in a Trans Am in 1989. That turbocharged V6 produced 250 horsepower at a time when the standard Trans Am V8 made 210. The anniversary car made more power, weighed less over the front axle, and in testing ran quarter miles in the mid to high 13-second range. It was proof that Pontiac's engineering team was still thinking, still finding unconventional answers when the conventional approach wasn't delivering the numbers they needed. The third generation Firebird and Trans Am didn't generate the same cultural explosion as the Bandit era. Cars. The 1980s were complicated years for performance. The whole industry was still working out how to deliver what buyers wanted under the rules that had been handed to them. But Pontiac had survived. Again. And in 1989, the design work was already underway on what would become the most capable Firebird in the brand's history. Chapter 8. The final generation. When the fourth generation Firebird arrived for the 1993 model year, it had been delayed by GM repeatedly. Development budget cuts, corporate priority changes. The same pressures that had nearly canceled the car in the early 1970s were still present in every planning meeting. But when the car arrived, it was worth every delay. The fourth generation Firebird was, in many ways, the most complete performance car Pontiac had ever produced. The design was modern, without chasing trends. Clean, integrated lines. The car looked like it belonged to the 1990s, while remaining unmistakably connected to the legacy of everything that had preceded it. The Trans Am variant carried the LT1 5.7-liter V8, shared with the Corvette, producing 275 horsepower. After a decade of watching output figures climb slowly back from the lows of the mid-70s, 275 horsepower in a production, Trans Am felt like a genuine return to what this brand had always been capable of. Quarter-mile times were back in the mid-13-second range. 0 to 60 in the mid-5-second range. Sports car territory, real measurable territory. Car and driver, motor trend, road and track, the press responded with what amounted to a collective exhale. The Firebird and Trans Am were good again. Properly, seriously, good. And then, in 1998, Pontiac did something that transformed the fourth generation cars from impressive to outstanding. General Motors introduced the LS1V8, an all-aluminum 5.7-liter engine that represented a complete clean sheet redesign of the American Performance V8. Better airflow, more efficient combustion chambers, a fundamental rethinking of what a domestic performance engine should be. The LS1 made 305 horsepower in the 1998 Firebird. By 1999, refinements had pushed the Trans Am version to 320. In 1999, Pontiac celebrated 30 years of the Trans Am the only way that made sense. They went back to the beginning. The 30th anniversary Trans Am wore polar white paint with bright blue racing stripes, the same combination as the original 1969 car. White and blue interior accents carried the theme inside. Special badging made the connection to 30 years of history explicit. 320 horsepower through the LS1. 0 to 60 in the low 5-second range. Quarter mile in the low 13-second range. By any objective standard, the 30th anniversary Trans Am was the quickest production Pontiac ever assembled at that point in time. Enthusiasts bought every single one of them. But General Motors had already made a decision. The F-body platform, economics had never fully stabilized. Development costs to bring the Firebird forward with a new platform, new safety architecture, and new emission systems were significant. GM management looked at the numbers and concluded that the financial case wasn't there to continue. In the fall of 2002, Pontiac assembled the last Firebird. The last Trans Am. 35 years of production. 23 years of the Trans Am as a distinct performance identity. Hundreds of thousands of cars carrying those names in every configuration from entry-level to full race specification. Done. The fourth generation cars, particularly the LS1, powered Trans Ams from 1998 through 2002 had proven that the engineering talent was still there. The intent was still there. The capability was still there. It was simply being allowed to stop Chapter 9, GM's last move. In 2004, Pontiac tried one more time. They brought back the GTO. The technical specifications were genuinely serious. The 2004 GTO arrived with a 5.7-liter LS1 V8, making 350 horsepower. The 2005 model received the upgraded 6-liter LS2, pushing 400 horsepower. These were not modest numbers. These were competitive, capable, real-world performance figures. The platform sourced from Holden in Australia, where the Monaro had been producing exactly this kind of rear-wheel drive V8 performance, was proven. The car was fast, capable, well-balanced, and genuinely enjoyable to drive. The problem wasn't under the hood. The problem was what buyers saw when they looked at the outside of the car. The original GTO had visual authority, wide hood scoops, bold character lines, an exterior that communicated performance before the engine was ever started. The Bandit Trans Am had it. The Ram Air Judge had it. Even the stripped-down 1976 Firebirds had a stance that told you exactly what they were. The 2004 GTO was a two-door coupe with smooth, flush exterior surfaces and no hood scoops. Clean, well-proportioned, but visually quiet in a way that the GTO name had never been quiet. American buyers who remembered the original or who had grown up with the legend looked at the new car and didn't see the connection they expected. Sales numbers reflected the response. 11,729 units in year 1, 13,000 in year 2. Numbers that weren't a failure by most standards, but for a car carrying the most legendary name in American muscle car history, they were well below what GM needed to justify continuing the line. The GTO was discontinued again after 2006, but Pontiac had one final card to play, and this one was a strong hand. The 2008 Pontiac G8 was, by honest assessment, one of the best performance sedans General Motors had ever put on American roads. Based on the Holden Commodore platform, the G8 GT came with a 6-liter V8 producing 361 horsepower. The flagship G8 GXP carried the 6.2-liter LS3 415 horsepower. 4 doors, rear-wheel drive, manual transmission available, 0 to 60 in the low to mid 4-second range. Car and Driver compared it favorably to German performance sedans at twice the price. Motor Trend praised it extensively. Enthusiasts who drove one reported that this was exactly what they had been asking Detroit to build for years, a practical, powerful, affordable American performance sedan. Pontiac had finally built it. And then, in April of 2009, General Motors filed for bankruptcy. The restructuring that followed was rapid and unsparing. Every brand was evaluated for its contribution to future profitability. Pontiac operating without the Firebird, with a GTO that hadn't connected at the volume needed, and with a G8 that hadn't had time to build its audience, was evaluated and determined to be a line the reorganized GM could not carry forward. On April 27, 2009, General Motors announced Pontiac would be phased out. The G8 was discontinued before most buyers had seen one on the road. The Solstice, a genuine American sports car that enthusiasts had genuinely responded to, was canceled before its next development cycle could begin. Everything stopped. Not because the cars were poor. The G8 GXP was one of the strongest performance sedans in America at the moment it was canceled. Not because the brand had run out of viable product, but because the corporation that owned Pontiac was in crisis, and crisis demands simplification. GM protected its core and removed what it had decided were non-essential assets. The last Pontiac was built in October of 2010, what they left behind. John DeLorean bent the rules of General Motors in 1964 and gave America the muscle car. 46 years later, the company that employed him decided the brand he built wasn't worth carrying forward. What Pontiac left behind isn't a cautionary story. It's a catalog. A 68,000 Trans Am year, a 345 horsepower Ram Air engine that the insurance industry feared enough to document, A 2002 moment with an LS1 V8 that reminded everyone what was still possible when the engineering matched the intention. The cars are still out there. Values on clean, Trans Ams, original GTOs, and surviving SD455 cars have climbed consistently for 2 decades. The market remembers what the corporation chose to forget. Pontiac didn't run out of ideas. It ran out of protection inside the company that owned it. That is the story of Pontiac, the greatest performance brand Detroit ever built and the one it walked away from.